I mean, I hope if we learned anything from the pandemic, it was that suddenly paywalls, came down, resources were opened up, collaborations were really encouraged.
So, just in terms of how things stand today, what are your thoughts about maybe what are one or two challenges going forward for the whole industry?
I think the two biggest problems are the APCs and the career incentive. First, we really need to change funding and how funding is distributed and how researchers are supported. So when we shift that funding, we'll see a shift in who gets to publish in the so-called prestigious journals because they have more funding and ability to be able to compete in that space.
Another topic that I wanted your thoughts on, Ashley, was preprints. I think during the whole pandemic, clearly it helped a lot in terms of just getting the research out there quicker. But at the same time, there's maybe a lot of resistance to change and maybe lack of clarity, not enough being done to communicate the benefits.
I think a lot of the hesitancy around preprints is that it could show and really highlight the cracks in the current system. So I think that really shows the power that researchers can have of just owning the distribution of their work as well.
Hello and welcome to Insights XChange, conversations shaping academic research. I'm your host, Nikesh Gosalia. In the ever-evolving world of academic discourse, there's one concept that has become a beacon of progress and inclusion: open research. At its core, it's the movement to make scientific research accessible to all. It's pivotal because it democratizes knowledge, accelerates innovation, and bridges gaps in understanding. By breaking down the traditional barriers of knowledge dissemination, it fosters a culture where collaboration and shared insight help build a better understanding of scientific progress. In this transformative landscape, we are fortunate to be joined by a trailblazer. As the Program Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Ashley Farley isn't just observing the change, she's driving it. With her relentless passion and clear vision, she's redefining how we perceive, share, and utilize academic research in the modern age. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. So to just get started, Ashley, I think I've read a lot about your journey into open access, into open research, but just for the benefit of all our listeners, could you just talk about how did you basically become passionate about this, or were you always passionate about this?
No, it's been quite an interesting journey. So my background is in librarianship. So I've worked in both academic and public libraries for most of my career, mainly as a paraprofessional until I went to graduate school at the University of Washington's iSchool. And through that experience, I was actually a little burnt out on libraries and just trying to figure out where my place was. And open access, open science wasn't a core part of the curriculum, but I was lucky enough to be able to work on a project that was supported by, at the time, the main librarian at the Gates Foundation. And through that work and the internship, I started working on open access. And as soon as I started learning more about it, it just kind of opened up the floodgates of my interest and passion, and I connected it with my past experiences. So, I remember, working in public libraries, specifically Seattle Public Library was one of the biggest library systems I've worked in, and having people come in asking reference questions and wanting access to information, and running into paywalls, and not paywalls that we could potentially help out with. And kind of in those days is when I started to learn a little bit more about piracy of information, and I thought it was absurd that I want to help this person who's a member of this community and make their lives and the community better, but I can't necessarily share this information legally because I'm protecting copyright specifically of a publisher. And so I never really made that connection then, but as soon as I started to learn more about academic publishing and open access, it kind of clicked into place. And I'm like, this is just an absurd way of, creating and disseminating knowledge, and I want to make it better. So that's when I first started really working on the open access policy at the foundation in 2015. It really sparked a passion, because I'm like, how are people not more outraged about the current state of this?
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that, Ashley. And I remember clearly when I was relatively new to the industry. I mean, that was probably about I've had some experience working with researchers, but when I came to the other side, that was about 10 years back. And when I started to see some of your tweets, and then I used to always wonder, Ashley is really, really very transparent, very direct, very honest about,
Yeah.
and that can happen only because you're so passionate about it. And fast forward to today, then, and to talk a little bit about where we are. So I and all of us, obviously, we don't hear any conversations about, what is open access? Should we even move towards open access? Clearly, the conversation has shifted to how do we transition to open access? How do we take it to the next level? So clearly, there's been, a lot of progress. So maybe two parts to the question, Ashley. One is, how do you see the last 10 years in terms of the progress in open access? But just specifically, going to the kind of the one of the critical, or probably the most important stakeholder in the whole research life cycle, the researchers. Do you have any advice for them in terms of how can they understand and interpret open access, and how do they really kind of make this transition?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to make one quick comment. So I do want to acknowledge that I think I can be more transparent and direct because I'm kind of adjacent to the research community. Like, my career does not depend upon where I publish. So I do feel like that's a bit of a gift and something that I can, speak up for others that can't, because I definitely understand that dynamic, and that's an important one. But I also think overall things have shifted. So yeah, I think in the last, 10 years or even longer, things are starting to get a certain momentum. And also, I mean, I hope if we learned anything from the pandemic, it was that suddenly paywalls, came down, resources were opened up, collaborations were really encouraged in order to solve a, global pandemic problem. And I'm sure we all know that there's a long list of other issues and problems throughout the world that should be treated with such urgency. But I am a little saddened to see that, we're now, 3 years in, and we've kind of seen a transition back to the normal state of how we publish. Paywalls came back up very quietly. Resources became more restricted again. But I think the funders have played a very strong role in, really reinforcing the importance of open access. The tireless advocates, like, this is a space where it's really hard, I think, to keep an energy to push for change, because the wins can be quite small. And while those wins do add up and we see things changing, for example, we've seen in the US, it was big to see the Nelson memo last year, but now we're seeing certain efforts trying to stop that progress of that coming into actuality. And so it's hard to remain an advocate, but it's important, I think, to keep the end goal in mind. And at this point, it's with the technology we have, with how the world works globally, it's absurd to think of, paywalls and restriction and gatekeeping uh, being sustainable in the status quo. And I would just say for researchers that are, trying to engage more in open access, learning about open access, I try to really encourage our grantees. And it's fascinating to see even the, researchers that have been publishing for decades and have been engaged in research for decades aren't fully aware of the current publishing process and what things like copyright transfer agreements mean, and kind of, what the policies are until they're at the end point of the publication. And when you've worked a year to get this article published, like, you're at any point just be like, get it out there. And I think that's a little bit by design. And I know I can be typically pretty harsh on a lot of publishers, but I'm, mainly when I'm generalizing publishers, I'm talking about the top commercial publishers. I think they've kind of designed the system that way so that, they get what they need to drive their profits and business. And the authors kind of get stuck in the middle. So I really have been encouraging authors to, really ask questions up front, push back on copyright transfer, and make sure that they keep as much of the rights to their work as possible. And I think that's fairly new and something that a lot of researchers haven't considered in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. And just where things stand today, Ashley, with like you mentioned, the Nelson memo. There's obviously been the Coalition S and the Plan S, the whole APC model. So just in terms of how things stand today, what are your thoughts about maybe what are one or two challenges going forward for the whole industry in say the next 2 or 3 years, and any thoughts on how can we overcome those, how do we get the other parties involved, and what could potentially be the way forward?
I think the two biggest problems are the APCs and the career incentive, and that's what we keep running into time and time again. APCs being a bit newer because it at first, it kind of made sense as you're shifting models. There's only so much that you can do to kind of pay. I mean, we understand that it costs to run a journal, to have publications, especially for the what we would consider like the great open access journals that we partner with that really focus on also sharing of data and other research outputs. Like those are the groups that we want to support, and that does cost something. So I can see, you know, where initially made sense to have that kind of like we pay for that article to be made open access, but it's gotten way out of hand. Like we support the $12,000 APC for Nature, and we know why it costs so much is because of that prestige branding, and they reject 92% of their articles. So then the rest of the research community has to like recoup those costs for that, and I don't think that's beneficial to the research community in a very big way. So I think trying to rethink sustainable open access models. There are great examples out there, but they are slow to catch on, and then they're slow to catch on because of the career incentive system. So I think those are the two biggest things we have to tackle, and funders and groups have been trying to tackle the incentive system for much longer than the APC model. So that's, I think, the two hardest parts to tackle. But there are ways forward, and the way that I'm thinking about this now is really thinking quite big. Like we, I think, get too stuck in trying to flip the system as it is now, and I don't think that's going to be possible. Nor do I think that that's the best thing to do in a content knowledge creation way. We have so much more technology, so many different tools and ways that we can be thinking, that we still are putting in articles in a volume and edition and page numbers, and we're still most of the publishing journal community is still in that, I think, kind of print era. And so trying to think past that is hard for the community to transition to. But I think that's really the only way that we can get to a sustainable and equitable open access model, is if we drastically change how we produce the knowledge, how it's shared, and then how it's accounted for.
I agree with you, Ashley. Yeah. Just moving on, we know that the whole issue around climate change and there are other really important challenges that we've been talking about. So, for example, another one is the public health crisis. What role can open access play in addressing some of these critical global challenges from your perspective?
I think, of course, getting around a paywall is important, and that's kind of the first step, is making sure that anyone anywhere can have access to the research and read it. And I'm a huge proponent of really believing that anyone can derive value from that article or work. Like I met a lot of patient advocates, or a lot of people that aren't considered experts in this space, or are really familiar and comfortable with scientific literature, but still can engage in it. And I think it's important that we don't kind of gatekeep from that kind of level of expertise. So having access to the information for anyone, I think, is absolutely critical, but that's also a very small component of what I would then level up to open research. And I think open research is really kind of the keys to the kingdom, where we have more robust open data, where we have open components of the research cycle and process so that anyone can access and build upon them. I think having rights to use them openly. There's a lot of talk about AI, and I've been trying to catch up with that from our perspective as well. As like, okay, what would we need to set up the scientific literature that we have, make sure it's licensed in a way that we protect what we need to protect when we're using AI and training tools and things like that, and what can we unlock when we actually allow that to happen, because so much of that is still in control of large commercial publishers. So I think those are the elements that will really allow for one much more collaboration just organically when things are open. And I think researchers really do want to act in good faith and collaborate, so you get more co-authorship and less waste of resources as well. So people aren't duplicating efforts. I think all of that is kind of core to the open research dream.
Got it. I know inclusivity is really, really important. And maybe over the last few years, we are hearing more about it. I know you believe a lot in that, Ashley. I know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does a lot of work in that. But just from your perspective, again, where do you think we are in that journey? Are we doing enough, or can more be done? I mean, there's obviously always more that can be done. But just your thoughts on where we are in the journey.
I think we're at the very, very early stages. And this is actually conversations I'm having right now as we're thinking about the next iteration of our open access policy. I would like it to really lead with an equity lens. And I think we're struggling a bit of what that actually looks like. And to me, that shows we're focused on publications, right? With the open access policy, that's a pretty small scope out of the entire research enterprise. And I think that really shows that there are larger symptoms and problems. So first, we really need to change funding and how funding is distributed and how researchers are supported. When we talk about looking at the impact of our policies on, say, low middle income countries, organizations, and authors, like we fund out of everything we fund, around like 10%. So we have to shift that, I think, to start to be able to see real progress in being more inclusive and having, more of an equity lens in our goals. And so it starts with, the funding, and then it's who do we pick for partners and how do we drive those conversations. And I think understanding that that'll take time, and it'll take time to develop those partnerships and relationships, and then really understanding the different needs. So of course, you could give a large sum of money through a grant to an established US institution, and they'll have a lot of resources to be able to do the work quickly, but that might not be best for kind of what our goals and outcome are trying to be, especially if we're trying to meet certain DEI goals and how we work. So when we shift that funding and we're thinking about, what are the resources then that maybe in-house we have to support more open research practices. So how can we help them with publishing? We've been trialing some resources to help those authors be able to compete in the academic space and publishing. And with that, I think, we'll see a shift in who gets to publish in the so-called prestigious journals, because they have more funding and ability to be able to compete in that space. And so I think we're pretty early on, but I would be very curious to hear from you kind of what do you think would be a more equitable open access policy or mechanisms for open access that would have I think a bigger impact than we have now.
Yeah, no, I think that's, first of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Ashley. I think from our perspective, we've been working with researchers all across, the globe. And what we are essentially seeing is there is one, a lack of proper infrastructure for a lot of researchers in many countries. So that could be, for example, how do you even access content? How do you disseminate and talk to your fellow peers? There is very, very low knowledge around any tools, any apps being used, or even any other mediums like social media channels to talk about specific research areas. But I think the other is also accessing a lot of publication support services, and how do you really make them affordable? One potential way that we're seeing is the use of AI, use of technology to kind of really bring some of those costs down. But there is still a lot to be done because of there's so many issues around the language barrier, translations becoming an important part. But if you really have to have specialized folks from a particular subject area with very niche requirements, you need to have experts doing that, and that comes at a certain cost. So there are those kind of barriers. I think what we're seeing essentially, if we can create a platform where researchers can access content, can talk to their fellow peers, can use services which are much more accessible, and then of course share, disseminate, learn from each other. That's something that we and in that respect we're trying to see if we can build more like an ecosystem for researchers where all of these services and other third party tools and applications can be brought in, and this just becomes more of a democratic system for not just researchers who are based in the US, the UK, Europe, but all the other countries as well.
Yeah.
Great. So I think just talking, and I definitely wanted to pick that up a little later in the conversation, but because you referred to AI, Ashley, and it's such a topic, a hot topic that's being discussed. We all know that there are certain advantages, but there are also certain things which we don't know answers to. So, and there's obviously a lot of worry around the ethics, the use of it, maybe supporting bad actors in paper mills and other kind of. In terms of where currently the whole policy stands, any thoughts on how can AI help us, and then what are the potential dangers that we are facing as well?
Yeah. So I mentioned a little earlier that I feel like we can't flip the current system, and that we're going to have to kind of re-envision a new one and actually leverage technologies like AI. And where I think our immediate thinking and where we could leverage it is if we're trying to get out of, I think, kind of the journal title and prestige game, looking more towards preprints, which are journal agnostic, which I think is one of the major benefits of having preprint servers where the manuscript can be posted, very public, very low cost. We can build technologies on top of that to do some validations and checks that'll help, I think, build up the trust and credibility in the preprints. Because one of the reasons that we've been hesitant to go kind of all in on a preprint policy and really require and push for those is the community's concern around, there could be harmful information that's published. So the only way I can really think about how to improve upon that is what kind of tools that we can leverage to keep the costs low, keep the burden low on the research community. So we're already doing a lot to be able to publish a paper and share data and information, and so we don't want to add any extra hoops to jump. So the technology that we can leverage to be able to do certain checks to keep the kind of human component down, and then use the human component to fill in the important spots to kind of add validity to that. So that's where our current thinking is. How can we leverage those technologies kind of on top of a preprint and add that more of that trust? I think will be critical in shaping our policy, and then what we require, and then kind of what is valued as an information artifact.
Got it. Again, another topic that I wanted your thoughts on, and especially because you mentioned it, Ashley, was preprints, and they've obviously been around for a few years. There's been a lot of progress. I think during the whole pandemic, clearly it helped a lot in terms of just getting the research out there quicker. But at the same time, there's maybe a lot of resistance to change, and maybe lack of clarity, not enough being done to communicate the benefits. I mean, it could be a host of reasons. There's a lot of fear as well. And when we speak to a lot of scientists and researchers, just the very thought that there's going to be a paper that's going to be out there, maybe with parallel peer review being done, or peer review after publication. I think they're just kind of grappling to come to terms with that and acceptance around it. And then, of course, there's the whole kind of parallel conversation around fake news and nobody's kind of validating what's out there. So, long story short, I mean, I just again wanted your thoughts in terms of how do you see preprints and the role that it can play going forward. And again, just for the benefit of the listeners, what can we do to really make that a more robust, more solid system?
From my viewpoint, I think a lot of the hesitancy around preprints is that it could show and really highlight the cracks in the current system and how we kind of have gone all in and trust a current system that I don't think is built for purpose any longer anymore. And I can see the hesitation. I can see why that's scary. I can see why there are communities and society journals and editors that spend a lot of time and energy to make sure that there's trusted, robust science being put out there. But I don't think that can happen at a volume anymore with how much is being published and produced. So I do see preprints as a great way forward to kind of get us out of the thinking of we have to have an article as a container that has a method section, and a discussion section and a conclusion. That we get out of thinking the journal has to be the container for that article. And so we can start to think, even though most preprints are kind of those, structures, but it's getting us away from that connection with a specific journal. Yeah, I think there is hesitancy. What I find most interesting is now a lot of the hesitancy is less around trusting those preprints, and at least what we're hearing from some of our authors as we really explore kind of upping our requirements and expectations around preprints is once you've released it to the world, they're really worried that it's going to take away kind of the, maybe prestige isn't the right word, but I'll use that, the prestige of the final publication coming out of the journal, which I understand, but it kind of blows my mind that I'm like, okay, so what is the goal here then? Is it to make sure that this information is widely accessible and has a broader impact, or is it really that that stamp of the publication and adding it to your CV? So I think that really highlights kind of a conflict at times of what the real goals are and what we're trying to accomplish. And that's why I worry that sometimes career advancement is too tied into publishing and knowledge dissemination, and it's really hard to decouple. But maybe preprints are a way to do that. There's a lot of great advocacy and groups that are working and changing, the incentives. I do think if funder policies require it more and we have better tracking and making sure that there's preprints, that we'll start to see that lessen the stress of posting them lessen. I always like to talk about preprints as a way that really demonstrates the power of the researcher over their own work. Because at first, journals, rightfully kind of panicked, and they're like, no, we won't accept it if it's been pre-printed. But that had to change over time, because there began to be such a, especially in several disciplines, like that became the standard as you post a preprint and then you go through the formal publishing process. That, if journals wanted to stay competitive and get that research, they had to change their policies. So I think that really shows the power that researchers can have of just owning the distribution of their work as well. And I'd like to have that message resonate more with the community. And I'll say, as a quick aside around the mis and disinformation and the reporting, I think that is a very important topic, but I also feel like that can't be solved necessarily through the publishing process. That is a bigger issue that has to be tackled by the community, and especially those journalists, librarians with expertise in the space on that topic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And just one of the things that I've also been thinking about for quite some time is the point you mentioned around the fact that the publications are tied to career advancement for researchers. And I've been trying to kind of think of what an alternate system might look like, actually, in terms of, if not, say, publications, does it have to be linked to anything as such? Or can there be an alternate system where, it's not all about the impact factor and the prestige, like you correctly said, but it's about, yeah. And so again, just any thoughts on, if it's not publication, what might it look like for a researcher?
That's a real tough one, but interesting. I think it's an interesting space to try and think through. It's been a while since I've seen this, but about 5 years ago, there was a real push for different groups that wanted to either have a different metric, or no metrics at all. I mean, I do like the idea of that we don't have to kind of measure on production in that way. Or if we do try to measure things, I would love to see it be, how much did you collaborate in the space that you're in? How can we, better support like mentorship and the time that takes, and people that are, working closely with their communities outside of academia. Like, how can we uh, better measure or reward, work that leads to policy changes, or working with practitioners on the ground, where I think there's a real immediate impact happening there that's totally kind of invalidated or missed when we're only counting publications. So, but it's hard. I don't think that's going to be an easy shift. And I've seen a lot of projects start and kind of stutter and kind of having those different metrics. Um, but I do believe something needs to be done to change. But it's gonna take a long time.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. I think definitely something needs to change. Few different stakeholders from the industry need to come together, think of an alternate system, maybe run a few pilots and then kind of build on it. So agree with you. Yeah. Talking very specifically about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the great work that you and your team have been doing. Can you, for the benefit of the listeners, talk a little bit about what essentially are the strategic objectives or the mandate for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then maybe talk a little bit about your role as well?
So, overall, the foundation, I think we're up to 8 billion in funding a year, which is a lot of money to move around. But I sit in global health, so we focus a lot on kind of global health needs. That's where a lot of the COVID work happened. But we also have our global development, our global growth and opportunities. That's where a lot of our ag work. So we have and nutrition, so a lot of different focus areas. We also just recently, the past couple years, with Melinda's guidance, we have a gender equity team. So undertaking that work has been really exciting, and that's something that touches every area of focus that we have. But yeah, my remit specifically is focusing on the open access publications and publications of our grantees, but the scope has been broadening to data as well, and that's where my interest is going. Like, I think publications are important and good, but I know there's been references in the past that they're basically an advertisement for the work, and I think that really resonates with me and is true in seeing how our program staff work as well. Like, oftentimes publications happening so late after the research that it's almost kind of old news at that point. So they're wanting to get the data and access to insights sooner, so we can be able to pivot any strategic thinking if needed. So now there's a real focus on that data component, but I'm sure, as you know, that is a much tougher problem to solve, and it's also slow to make changes, because anything that we kind of integrate into our system to pilot or test, that's at the beginning of the grant making process, and then we maybe have 2 to 3 years for the work to be done, and then try to assess if we had any impact and how that data is shared. But I think even small steps can really make progress, and so we're focusing on data availability statements in our publications, and can we better describe where the data is, support repositories, like how can we kind of set up a data access program for our grantees to tap into and really help make that a reality. So I think, yeah, we are definitely shifting to think more robustly about data sharing and access.
Got it. And just when you were talking a little bit about the global health and yeah, just around the topic around the public health, just one of the things that came to my mind, Ashley, and it's a question for you, is do you predominantly work with, say, researchers who are based, from or are from the global south, or do you work with researchers from other geographies as well? And if so, then how do you get all of the researchers from different geographies to work on similar kind of problems? For example, I don't know, malaria, to collaborate.
Yeah, I think we're shifting our approach a lot, which is exciting because I think it's better supporting our DI goals and becoming more equitable. Where in the past we can be very much like giving a lump sum to a U.S. based institution who then will fund other work on the ground, say in Africa, and working with so we I think typically kind of fund the I would say like kind of the middleman to do that. And now we're thinking of like, okay, that's maybe not the best approach. And then we aren't as supporting as much as we should the people who are directly impacted by the problems we're trying to solve. So I do see a shift in that happening. And with that, we're learning a lot about the additional resources they may need. So we have to rethink, when we're funding a project, we need to include the kind of resources that they'll need to be successful in that work that we might not have had to include when we were funding to a large organization that has a lot of resources, is already quite privileged in the space. So I do see that shift happening because I think right now we don't do enough direct funding in the areas that we want to improve. But we do work globally. We have global offices everywhere. We are restructuring and setting up our offices in Africa, but we have a lot of engagement on the ground in areas, um, and then we just have to make sure that funding reflects that appropriately, and we're making shifts in how we think about who we're funding and who we're working with.
Got it. And anything obviously that you can share, Ashley, but are there any specific examples or success stories that come to your mind, which you can share just for, again, listeners to understand how some of these successful partnerships have been implemented?
Yeah, I mean, specifically for open access, I think we're getting there. It's still early stages, so that's what's shaping my thinking. Is we've had a policy since 2015. Like, what have been our impacts, and what are we positively changing in this space? And I think overall it's been fairly little because we continue to pay APCs. They go continually to the largest, for-profit publishers. So if we start to shift that thinking and really focus on partnering with publishers and groups and institutions that reflect our values, I think will have an even greater impact. I think one of the projects I've been most proud of is how we track compliance in our reporting and have kind of our publication data. So we've been working with OA Works, which is a nonprofit open sourced organization, and our goal was to really help them scale and create something that other funders could tap into as well. So my thinking is, if we make a policy, building a policy, checking its compliance and reporting, which I think is really important for having a policy that makes change, is that kind of care and feeding, then we'll have more funders join in the space with us, because we really do need that collective action to really change publisher policies, to make sure researchers are much more aware. And so I think that's been a really great partnership, and we've built something cool, and it's opening up a lot of opportunities to do better. Like, I'm building upon it. Like, now we're going to start tracking preprints so we can better encourage those and make better comparisons. Like, so if we have all this data, we can build better policy. We can build more impactful implementation. So I'm quite proud of our partnership with OA Works, and OA Report is the kind of the big product for that kind of reporting.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Ashley. Just talking a little bit about the Gates Open Research platform, again, for the benefit of the listeners, if you could talk a little bit about how that works, because I remember when obviously it was launched a few years back, there was the partnership, with F1000. The idea was to publish as soon as possible, really ahead of times, I would say, when it first came out. And so how has the progress been? How does it work? What do you see next?
So that's another project that I am quite proud of for many reasons, but it's given me the opportunity to really talk with program staff and grantees about that different future. Like if we get away from just thinking about a journal and article, what can we accomplish? And and anytime I hear kind of innovation in the publishing space, I'm like, that's just kind of a lot like the F1000 model. So we launched Gates Open Research in 2016. We did have some pushback even internally, where like, what, open post publication peer review, like you're going to ruin science. But I have to say perceptions have changed over time, when as we've really kind of proved the concept and that the model. And I think for me it gets rid of a lot of what I think plagues the current system. So no journal shopping, you post it as a preprint, it goes through open post publication peer review. Once that's met the appropriate checks, it's then indexed. So there's no journal cascading. There's no rejection based off of novelty and scope. There's no impact factor. The only time something would be rejected is if there isn't the robust data supplied, or reasons that are robust enough why it can't be shared for legal reasons. So there's these articles that are published on the platform really reflect strong open research practices. And I think then that really shows how those articles are then used, and the data is used. It's a really strong case study. Especially during the pandemic, we saw attitudes change quite quickly when we had program staff that themselves struggled to publish quickly in certain places and venues that they typically went to. And then that motivated them, like, well, let's try Gates Open Research and see how it goes. And they were really surprised with the process, how easy it was, and still the engagement. So, I view scientific research and knowledge creation really as a conversation. And that's, I think, reflected very well on the platform when you see versioning control. So when there's errors or edits or new information to be added, you can change that article. As a reader, you can see all those changes and understand them. You can read the peer review reports. I think because it's so open, it really encourages authors to make changes where they might not in a more traditional sense, because it's past peer review, it's good enough. But when it's all kind of there and very transparent, we've seen authors go back and make changes to the article where it wasn't actually necessary in order to be published, but just wanting to make, I think, that article as good and robust as possible. So I've really loved the model. I do think it's if we're moving more towards a publish, curate, review, there's some really strong examples there. And where it's headed, I think we're looking at, while I do love the kind of no journal shopping, one-stop shop, to get greater adoption, I do think we are thinking about experimenting with, what if we had just a preprint component, and that's where our preprints were posted, and then we can use those kind of AI checks, and make that scaled up, and then the author has a good experience and sees the value of it, and they can go take it to some other journal if they still want, because we understand that might be needed for career advancement. But while we solve that problem, we at least have the information available on our platform.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that makes sense. Again, I wanted to confirm my understanding, and if you agree with this. So I see a lot more conversation happening in the West around the current system. What can we change? The whole APC model working, not working. But I don't see that same level of understanding or getting many more groups involved in discussing some of these things on the other side, in specifically some of the geographies like Japan, Korea, China. Obviously, all of us from our perspective are doing some bits of work, Ashley, in terms of organizing some events, discussing these. But I don't see that same level. What, in your opinion, can we do to, I don't know, kind of bridge that gap? And just another point to that is, I think recently there was a paper, a PLOS paper, on how the cost for a non-native English researcher, especially an early career researcher, to publish is much higher than, say, for a native English speaker. So again, that's just one data point, but there are so many different facets to this.
Yeah.
How do we kind of, all come together and reduce this gap in understanding, in dissemination, in the knowledge that
I think this is a very important topic, of course. I think it's been difficult because I don't know if necessarily we're at a point. I think we need to get to a point where those in, the global north recognize how kind of colonialistic the roots of academic publishing are. There's also a fantastic working paper that just came out, and I should know the title and author of it, but it really does a great job digging into kind of, the robber baron era of where peer review really started, and Robert Maxwell, selling and creating these things, and the indexes behind it. I think that's really critical to understand the history of it, because I think that's easily forgotten, overlooked, where we think that this is the way it's always been done for centuries and centuries, and we, for the sanctity of science, we have to continue that way. And I think it's hard, especially in the global north, to think outside of that. I mean, we've seen and what I think we're trying to learn from is our experiences. So we are part of Coalition S, and Plan S is our current policy, and we were really motivated to try and work with global funders worldwide. And it very kind of quickly in those efforts, we saw that because publishing may be viewed or rewarded differently by countries, it's really hard to coordinate on policy. And then we would see, and say, for example, Latin America has a very different system because they aren't, I think, as stymied in, prestige publishing, and so they already have a better network and system to support their researchers and their local languages and journals, and have that infrastructure. Like you mentioned earlier, having the infrastructure is, I think, quite critical. So, and then places like, India is very focused on trying to have basically one countrywide subscription and open access deal with the major publishers. And I can't imagine how hard that would be to try to negotiate and what that cost might look like. So I think it's hard when different countries are trying different routes because of how the research is done and then valued or measured. And that's, again, that kind of academic incentive is what gets in our way of collaborating. But I do think really it would start with the global north recognizing that this is not the best system, and that we don't know everything, and that we need to be more open to hearing those experiences. And another one that really bugs me is the indexing systems that we use, and how exclusionary many of them are to local journals in different languages in different countries. So that just perpetrates that kind of thinking and um, system. And yeah, I think we have to be more honest too, and have tough conversations, and be okay with that, and be open to change, which I don't think we are very open to right now.
absolutely. No, I fully agree with you, Ashley. Yeah. I know that, when we've spoken in the past, we've spoken about things like translation being a big need. A lot of researchers, feel extremely uncomfortable, but at the same time, maybe creating a platform, creating an ecosystem where they can publish in their own language. So, I mean, yeah, that's kind of talking about two or three different things. But my point being, there is translating science into one common language, but there's also translating science into maybe easier formats so that even lay audiences can understand. I know, you and I have spoken about things like plain language summaries, actually. I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts in terms of, I mean, from our perspective, we've been hearing and we've been getting some proof of concept that we definitely need to go beyond the journal article, or even probably, I don't know, in future think about replacing the journal article, but making things easier, simpler for people to understand, for people to engage, for people to then kind of realize how to use this information. What are your thoughts about, just converting complex science into easier formats, and how do you see that all of that developing?
I mean, I should caveat that, again, my perspectives from a librarian do not have a lot of technical, expert or, in-depth knowledge in a lot of these topics like vaccine development. Like I know they're complicated, but I do also, and maybe this is naive of me, but want to have a belief that it can be translated and it can be presented in very easy ways. I mean, I feel a bit like the current way that we write papers and a lot of the academic speak is just another form of gatekeeping. And we put a little too much emphasis at times, although albeit very important, on expertise, but not having that be the end all be all for who gets to access information and engage with it. So I would love to see, just in general, a shift from being so academic in how we communicate, so that we wouldn't have to take necessarily an extra step. Of course, it depends on the topic, but I think it's very important that we get to that space. And I know there's also a big push in pharma to have plain language summaries, and I find that really fascinating, and how that has a broader impact on the public. And so when we talk about things like mis and disinformation, like I can understand why there could be a distrust at times when there's so much layered gatekeeping on top of this information. I think it just makes it easier for people to abuse.
One of the questions that I asked all of my guests in the so-called season one, Ashley, was uh, was how do you keep yourself updated, about the industry and even beyond. I mean, actually, just anything to do with science. So any.
I I hate to say it, but I still use Twitter a ton. Are we calling it X now? Let's call it Twitter. So Twitter is still one of my main channels, because there is, since 2015, have built such a great following and have had so many great mentors in that space and building communities, that I still am surprised at how, no matter the changes that have happened over the last year, there's still a lot of great researchers and community and sharing of papers. So that's honestly one of the ways I still keep up to date, because it's just so easy. But in a bigger sense, I love, I help plan and moderate the OpenCon community calls that are run by Spark. So that's a really important community to me. And as a librarian, like even though I'm not working in a traditional library right now, I still want to stay connected. And I think funders should be more connected with library communities on topic of open access and publishing. So staying involved in those communities, I'm involved in a lot of different funder groups, like the Open Research Funders Group, the Coalition S, and so that helps keep me updated on what funders are doing, where we're looking for policies, how we can best collaborate. Yeah, so I think those are kind of the two. Like social media, of course, is always kind of be great for that quick, seeing what's sharing of papers and staying up to date that way. And then the more traditional kind of community groups that you can engage in.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Ashley. I mean, I think it's been a while that and I fully agree with you. I mean, I am quite active on Twitter as well, and it's really helpful. But it's been quite a while that somebody's spoken about it, because perhaps maybe people have mostly tried to use some of the usual channels in terms of just certain websites, and not to say that they are not great, but I think there are a lot more conversations happening on some of those other channels as well, and so that's really good to know.
Yeah, I'm trying to wait to see who wins the platform game before like transitioning fully, because now I have so many different accounts everywhere. But Yeah. I mean, these platforms are quite important, and it's interesting that I see some of the most like robust post-publication peer review on there, and then when you start to follow people that you trust in the space, and it's hard to replicate that as easily somewhere else.
Yeah. If you were to convey one message to everybody in the industry, I mean, including researchers, of course, but all the other stakeholders, what would that be, Ashley?
The biggest thing to not be fearful of open access, and to take action, which I know is hard. It's hard, but we have seen some stakeholder groups that are still quite small that are taking action, and I think they need broader support, and we need more of that collective action in larger numbers. So get involved where you see exciting change happening and help kind of tip those scales. Because I do think there's still a lot of fear and misunderstanding that can just really kind of slow down any progress. I still find it fascinating that there'll be topics of conversation around like, just open access equate to quality or not quality, and I'm like, that's something that we should be past, discussing now as a community. Or, when I see conference schedules coming out and it's like the future of open access publishing, and I'm like, can the future be now? Like, are we there yet? Can we just do something to be, make some different changes? So again, I would say that changes don't have to be big. The wins can be small, and to value that progress, but to actively do something, I think is going to be most important.
Brilliant. I love your passion, and thank you so much for that, Ashley. Yeah. And just to kind of wrap up, to add a little bit of a personal touch to this. So when Ashley's not working, where does Ashley spend her time?
Oh, yes, yes. When I am, not sitting around thinking about this and being frustrated about the state of academic publishing, I am typically at the gym. If you follow me on Twitter, I haven't shared in a while, but I love Olympic lifting and doing CrossFit, or being out in nature doing anything, biking, hiking, playing with my dogs, getting away from the computer and outside. Is just such a valuable reset for me. And yeah, like I said earlier, it's so difficult at times to be an advocate in the space. So you got to do whatever kind of fills your energy back up.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing, Ashley. I want to extend a sincere thank you to you, Ashley Farley, for your insights and your time, your insights on open research, open access, and your work in this particular area has provided a clear perspective on where we are and what are some of the upcoming challenges that we face. Clearly, your dedication to this cause underscores the significance of open access in this evolving landscape. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in and being part of this conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Feel free to write to us at insightexchange@cactusglobal.com or drop a comment on LinkedIn. Any feedback, questions, and perspectives are what makes this exchange of insights so valuable. So thank you, everyone.